This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. If there is one word that we have said on this show more than any other in the past 3 months, it is uncertainty. It comes up when we talk about the potential effects of cuts to federal grant programs, staffing reductions at government agencies, and the tariffs levied against Canada, China, and other countries around the globe. Today on the show, we are going to try to dispel some of that uncertainty by explaining the current state of the trade war and how it's already affected the economies of both Quebec and Vermont. We'll also take a trip through history to hear about other periods of economic upheaval that could teach us something about today. And at the end of the hour, we'll calm our heart rates a bit with a conversation with a money mindset coach who helps people talk about their finances. First, we are lucky enough to have two experts on economics and the stock market, one from each side of the Canada-US border. Joining us from Montreal is Moshe Lander, a senior lecturer of economics at Concordia University. He specializes in international trade and finance and economic policy. Welcome.
Hello.
We're so glad to have you with us, Moshe. Also with us in Burlington is Dan Cunningham. He's the founder and CEO of One Day in July, an investment advisory firm. Dan, welcome.
Hi, good to be here.
And listeners, you can join our conversation as well. If you hear a term come up during this conversation and you're like, what in the world does that mean? Give us a call. Now is the time to get your financial questions answered. Our number is 800-639-2211. You can also send us an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Gentlemen, I'd like to start us in a bit of an unconventional place. It's with a clip from that classic financial film, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. You might remember the famous Bueller line from The High School Teacher. But what you might not have noticed is that he was actually trying to teach the students an important economic lesson that day in school. Let's take a listen.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the Anyone? The Great Depression, passed the anyone? A tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which raised or lowered? Raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression.
It's a funny scene, but he actually really is talking about a key event in history that occurred about 100 years ago. Moshe, could you tell us about the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act and maybe what we could learn from today?
I will happily tell you about that, but I'll also point out as well that Ben Stein, the actor who played that character, has a degree from Columbia. I don't know if Dan is going to be able to accept Columbia as a competition for Princeton, but his degree in economics is pretty sound, so he actually knew what he was talking about there. The Smoot-Hawley Act essentially was just a set of tariffs that were meant to protect the U.S. from the crashing stock market and the economic recession that eventually turned into the depression. And so by trying to limit the exposure to trade and reliance on its trade partners, it figured that it could insulate itself. And in fact, what it did was it created a lack of shock absorbers. And so as things went badly in the US, there was nobody to share the pain with. It's almost like if you live alone and you get bad news, who do you have to help you when times are bad? If you're alone, you have nobody. And that's what the US found. But it also encouraged everybody else to try and go it alone as well. And what turned from a bad recession into a Great Depression could have easily been avoided if not for those two, Smoot and Hawley.
And I like in the clip how he calls him Hawley Smoot, too.
Yeah.
Dan, is A, are you a Ferris Bueller fan? B, what else do you think we could learn from that period in our history that kind of shines a light on today?
I am a Ferris Bueller fan, and importantly, my kids, who are all teenagers, are also Ferris Bueller fans, so there's kind of a revival there.
Well done.
But I think one of the things we could learn is we were around the 18-20% tariff range overall after that, and over the years, over a century approximately, so we've dropped to about 2%. And people did learn the pain of the Great Depression, and they learned the value of free trade. And I think we're having a national economics lesson in the past 2 weeks on why that's valuable. And it's really, there have been real positives there. So you're seeing kind of an unwinding of almost 100 years of learning and policy, and that does not feel good to a lot of people.
Wow, an unwinding of 100 years of policy. What are some examples of that?
Well, one of the things they learned is over time, and virtually I think all economists, with a few exceptions, one who's in the White House right now, agrees, you don't really close the trade deficit. You're raising because of reactions from other nations, the trade deficits, in fact, don't really fall. And the promises of tariffs just don't come true.
I promised that we would do some defining of terms today. Trade deficit is one of those phrases that we hear a bazillion times a day these days, but when I actually think about it, I don't really know what it means. Moshe, could you explain?
Sure. If you take all of the exports of goods and services that the US sells to everybody around the world, and you subtract from it all of the imports and goods and services that you buy from everybody around the world, you get the trade deficit or trade surplus. If exports are bigger than imports, it's a surplus. And if imports are bigger than exports, you have a trade deficit. And if they happen to coincidentally match, you have balanced trade. I would point out that because we hear the word surplus and deficit, we tend to think that surpluses must be good and deficits must be bad. It's almost implied in the name. But, I'll tell you, whenever I come to Burlington, I have a massive trade deficit with Dunkin' Donuts. We don't have it up in Canada. And so I buy from them way more than they buy from me. But my employer up here in Montreal, Concordia University, I have a massive trade surplus with them. I sell them way more goods and services. I don't buy anything from them. But nobody would walk around trying to say that I should have balanced trade with Duncan. Next time I come to Burlington, I'm going to force them to buy my economics lectures, and vice versa. There's no way that I'm going to be forced to start buying courses from Concordia as a student when I'm here as a faculty member. So if you appreciate that on a micro level, it would be ridiculous to think that we should always have balanced trade or that we should only have trade surpluses. You can appreciate then that if I told you my name were the United States of America and Duncan's name were China, we'd be having the same conversation. That seems ridiculous, but the occupant of the White House must have been away that day that they taught it.
Well, Moshe, no one can accuse you of not being a man of the people and being a Dunkies fan. You had something to add, Dan.
Yeah, I think the reverse is true for me with Tim Hortons. But yeah, and that's a great point. So for another example on that would be, if an American buys a lot of bananas from Panama, our utility goes up, our happiness goes up because we have bananas. Their happiness goes up because they have currency. What's the problem? And I think that's a great point, that the word sounds negative, but it's not necessarily negative at all.
All right. Moshe, one other thing that I think has been hard for folks to grab onto right now is the fact that it seems as quickly as a tariff is introduced, it then gets pushed back or canceled, or the date moves of when it's going to go into effect. Is that typical?
No. Well, first of all, there shouldn't be tariffs, period, right? So Dan was right that the lessons learned after the Depression and then subsequently the Second World War was that economic isolationism is generally a bad thing. So the United States and Canada were two signatories to something called the Generalized Agreement on Trade and Tariffs in 1947. That's almost 80 years ago. And the role of that, which eventually became the World Trade Organization, the WTO, was a move towards reducing tariffs, eliminating quotas, trying to increase economic interdependence and try and increase economic integration. Canada and the US realized by the 1960s that the auto sector was the great place to start with that. And that's what evolved into the CUFTA agreement, Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is now the CUSMA agreement that the president in his first term agreed to. We generally don't see tariffs coming into play at all, but certainly if you're going to introduce them, you better know what you're doing and you better have some clear, transparent strategy as to what you're trying to do and what would make them go away. all of that is missing under current policy.
Well, if you are feeling the effects of the current trade war with Canada on your business or maybe on your personal finances, and you have a question about it or what to do, give us a call at 800-639-2211. You can also email your thoughts to Vermont Edition at vermontpublic.org. With all this change going on, all this volatility, Dan, first, how long does it take for the impacts of these events to be felt locally?
Well, the impact's already being felt. I was at a tennis match, high school tennis match last night, and some parents on the sideline were talking about how they'd spent the days canceling purchase orders for their furniture store to China. So it's real. And the volatility, the drop in the stock market, that you see because the stock market looks forward. And it's anticipating that the economic effect is going to be pretty significant. But it's definitely here in terms of day to day.
Yeah. And Moshe, some of the on-the-ground effects there in Montreal? Moshe, are you there?
Sorry. Am I there?
Yeah. Hello. Now we can hear you. Yes.
Okay.
I was just asking about some of the on-the-ground effects there in Montreal that you've been seeing.
We're seeing auto closures next door in Ontario, which is a major part of the North American integrated auto industry. We've seen some companies here in Quebec say that they've lost their export markets. There's a tremendous amount of Canadians that are unwilling or afraid to come into the U.S. now because of border security and control. And on this side of the border, we're hearing media reports that Canadians are being roughed up a little bit when they want to try and cross, especially land borders. So coming to Vermont, I have a feeling that you're going to notice what we're noticing as well, which is the lack of Canadians, especially as the weather starts to get nicer. But you might even be noticing them on the ski slopes in the last little bit of winter here. I have a feeling that we're going to see some effects coming back in the other direction as well, which is Americans that are maybe feeling sympathy for Canada for the unprovoked trade war might come up here as part of their summer vacation to enjoy the Canadian weather, but also to try and bridge some of the hard feelings that really exist in Canada right now, and a tinge of nationalism and buy local that we haven't seen, especially in Quebec, which is known for its desires for separation and independence from the rest of Canada.
And you can read more reporting on how tourism businesses in Vermont are on edge as Canadian visitors are making those choices on our website, vermontpublic.org. Let's take a call. We have Stacy calling in from Morrisville. Stacy, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hi. First, I wanted to apologize to Canada and the rest of the world for what's going on. And secondly, I have a question. I wonder if the guests think, like I and many do, that this was all a scheme just to help the rich get richer.
Thank you, Stacy. Moshe?
Yeah, I don't know that I can go down that path of the cynical conspiracy path. It does look suspicious, though, that the timing of that text saying now's a great time to buy, and then all of a sudden the tariffs come away. You are playing with trillions of dollars of wealth here. And I don't know that the rich are necessarily going to take kindly to the wealth being manipulated that way, even if it stands to benefit them. I think it's much more that this is a president for 40 years in the public eye, has been rock solid on only one issue, and that's he hates trade. When he was a property mogul in New York, he didn't like trade then. He spoke out about the CUFTA agreement, the NAFTA agreement, before he ever got into politics. So I think this is just something that he views as a zero-sum game. And if we in Canada have a trade surplus with the U.S., and therefore trade deficit, the U.S. coming towards Canada, that must be that we're gaining, you're losing. And that's why he uses a lot of that language and rhetoric, which is dangerous, that they're being taken advantage of, and much stronger phrasing to imply how they're losing.
Dan, what do you think? Are the rich getting richer?
I agree with that. The rich are probably getting poorer under this. I don't know the exact details, but they're generally certainly no fans of this. I mean, I think what Moshe said, Donald Trump has kind of this antiquated view of economics, and he managed to find one academic economist who agreed with him in this whole sea of possibilities. So I'm not really sure that's the answer, in part because when you really look at it, a lot of tariff support, including from Bernie Sanders here in Vermont, was from the left historically. A lot of the majority of conservative think tanks are really, in conservative viewpoints, are really opposed to this. So, I think and so you have really funny dynamics politically going on, but I'm not really willing to go down that path either.
Yeah. Well, we're curious to hear what you think, our listeners. If you've been reading about these tariffs and do find yourself kind of excited or interested, that viewpoint is welcome here as well. So give us a call at 800-639-2211. We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, Dan and Moshe, I'd like to talk a little bit more about how these large-scale economic events between countries could affect the choices that we make for our businesses or with money that might be invested in, say, a 401k or retirement fund. That'll be in just a minute on Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. If you're just joining us, we are discussing tariffs, stock market volatility, and their effects on your personal budget or business. Our guests are Moshe Lander, an economics professor at Concordia University in Montreal, and Dan Cunningham, founder of the financial advisory One Day in July, based in Burlington. Some of you might have seen, as I did, a sketch from Saturday Night Live this past weekend. It was all about the current financial market turmoil and how confusing it can be for many of us. We're going to listen to just a segment of that sketch now. You'll hear guest John Hamm and cast member Ego Nwodum acting as news anchors in a fake CNBC-esque business show called Check to Check. Let's listen.
Well, markets are in turmoil right now. Let's check on the S&P 500, which is down 2.38%. The NASDAQ composite is down 265 points, and Dow Industrials are down 2.88%. Okay, does that mean anything to anyone?
I'm sure it means something to someone, but sounds like a bunch of gibberish to me. Let's take a look at boxed mac and cheese, which is up 4.5% to $1.59.
Whoa, even across the street?
Even across the street, Kenneth. And candy bars are up from sure, baby, to put that back.
Why don't we take a look at the healthcare sector, where so far in 2025, spending on doctor visits remains steady at zero.
But millions of Americans are investing in healthcare alternatives such as just go lay down, take an Advil, and pray it goes away.
All great options. Well, the Trump tariffs have caused T-bill sell-offs, which have rocked the bond markets.
Are you worried about that?
I'm not, and I'll tell you why. Because I don't know what that is.
All right, so that SNL sketch made me feel so seen. And I also think it gets at a real issue, Dan, that even if people don't have money invested in the stock market, these rises and falls are still going to affect people's finances and what they're buying at the store and lots of other things. Could you talk us through that connection a bit, especially for our listeners who don't have money in the stock market?
Without question, the market drives the psychology of the nation to some degree, and much more today than it did 25 years ago, because you just see the market tickers everywhere. You see green lines and red lines. Last week, it was flipping between red and green by the hour. And that's just really distracting to people, because investing and the finances are important to them, and the stock market is not in their control. So if you have something that's important that's not in your control, it really can be a recipe for anxiety and for stress. And our advice to people, as much as possible, is try not to read the financial news.
Oh.
You will feel much better.
Okay.
If you reduce news consumption, that's something you can control. And you don't need to.
How dare you come on Vermont Edition and tell people to reduce their
Notice
news
I put financial in there. I forgot to put it in the second time.
I get it.
No, but the point is, particularly with the markets, there's so much financial news, and it's really whiplashing people back and forth now.
Yeah.
And so reducing that actually helps you become a better investor, in part because you're detaching your emotions from your investments. So you're just calmer.
It does seem counterintuitive, though.
It definitely does. So one of the things about investing that's really important to know is watching more financial news, and trading the markets based on that is almost certainly a recipe to perform worse than an index fund over the years.
Huh. All right, good to know. Moshe, back to that original question I asked Dan. For you, how do you make that connection for folks, including people who are working minimum wage jobs and feel very distant themselves from the stock market? How do you make that connection between what's going on and somebody's personal finances?
So I think in general, much more people have a stake in financial markets now than they would have 20, 50, 100 years ago, where it used to be the elite and the privileged that could be involved in the stock market. Now, through things like mutual funds, pension funds that might exist through your employer, and even small contributions that can be aggregated, much more people have access to the stock market or to the bond market than they would have. So if you're still not at that point, if you are working a minimum wage job where you say, I can't even get the $5, $10 to aggregate with my friends, you're still going to be affected by stock market movements beyond just consumer sentiment and the way that that drives the economy. Your employer might have something invested in the stock market. And if they're finding that their wealth is being wiped out or being toyed with as it goes up and down, that's probably going to influence then how they treat you as an employee. If you go ask for a raise, this might not be a good time because it's too uncertain what our business model is going to be, or how much wealth we have tied up, or how much equity we have in the business, or whether we even want to be here. And of course, that's something that in Canada is our particular concern: is are we going to see Canadian businesses up and move to the U.S., as the president was saying, to avoid tariffs or uncertainty? And so it does have an effect on everybody beyond just psychologically. I think most people will find that they're a lot more invested, literally and figuratively, than they might have thought if they look beyond just their bank account balance.
Well, let's go to a caller. We have David in Wilmington on the line. David, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, I have a comment. I think what the president is doing since the beginning of his administration is to stop the global Marxist socialist movement in the world, and that includes tariffs and everything else he's done.
David, sorry, could you just explain a little bit more your point there, the connection between the tariffs and a global Marxist social movement? What exactly do you mean?
Well, it's a global movement, and everything he's doing is to thwart that movement from progressing.
Moshe, what I'm hearing from David here is this sort of, this us against the world mentality and Trump's push to return America to that, America first perspective that he has talked about so much on the campaign trail. I wonder if you could speak to David's comment a bit.
Sure. So again, I don't know that there's a global social Marxist movement that's going on out there. What I would agree is that over the last 80 years, there has been increasing globalization. And the thing is, with free trade, which just means that it's voluntary, it creates people who gain, let's call them winners, and it creates people who suffer, let's call them losers, just to kind of keep things clean. What I can tell you unequivocally is that the gains of the winners are greater than the losses of the losers under free trade. The problem is that the gains might be accruing to a smaller number of people where the losses are being borne by a larger number of people. And so in a democracy, if we vote on it, there might be more in the loser's side than there is in the winner's side. But from an economic standpoint, we're not worried about votes. We're worried about numbers. And numbers would suggest that we should be pursuing free trade with redistribution from the winners to the losers, and there should still be money left over. I think what's happened, though, is that governments have forgotten that they.
Oh, Moshe, we might have just lost you, but we'll reconnect. When you were talking about governments have forgotten something, I want to know what that was. But while we work to reconnect with you, I want to share an email for you, Dan, from a listener named Paul in Bridport, who writes that around 1999, 2000, his small diversified stock portfolio lost 55% and it's never fully recovered. It's up 50% from then, but that's still 25% below what it was the week before the crash. Paul has noticed that when the stock market declines, his stock portfolio has always declined even more. The dot-com bust was a good example. In a graph of the Dow Jones average showing perhaps 40 years of value, you could see that 1999 drop. It looks small in comparison to the overall rise of the market. So essentially saying his portfolio has always risen far more slowly than the Dow. This just seems to be the way it goes, Paul says. And I appreciate Paul bringing up the dot-com boom and bust. It's another historical period that we might be able to learn from today, right, Dan?
I lived through that. I was part of dot-com. I didn't cause it.
Oh, no, okay. What are you admitting to here?
But he's right. And when you look at now, it looks like a small thing on the graph. But at the time, we were down 50% or so from the peak of dot-com. And in that industry, roughly 90% of jobs were lost. I mean, it was a huge contraction from the peak. So, I think if he's trailing the market generally, it's probably time to index the portfolio because active managers generally tend to trail, and that might be the case. But it is something to really be aware of. Is that what happened from 2009 forward has been a booming stock market, and you can go long periods of time with returns that are suboptimal. They might be negative or it might be flat. That is part of investing.
So the lesson, the takeaway there is to look to the long term
You
over
definitely
the course
have,
of decades.
Yeah, the takeaway is to look to the long term, to stay calm, to index, and not to trade on the news.
Well, we have Moshe back with us. Moshe, we got you cut off in the middle of a thought there. I'd like to invite you to jump back in.
It requires I remember what I said. So I was saying that the gains of the winners exceed the losses of the losers,
Yes.
and the role of government is to merely redistribute, and that government has been neglecting that for 30 years. And so I can understand then why people who would have had jobs working in industry in the 1980s or 1990s and find that their jobs are now gone, or people who were worried about the future and the safety of their jobs might be looking, saying, I don't like this free trade thing. And I hearken for a day when it was the way they used to be. Nostalgia is a very powerful elixir. And I think that the president has tapped into that, trying to identify that we're going to make America great again, much the way that Reagan said that in the 1980s. It's to try and make people feel that somehow we can go back to the way things were. That's usually a recipe for disaster because progress is very difficult to stop, let alone reverse. Better to say, this is the way things are going. I'm here to help and make sure that anybody who's left behind is going to be helped and supported.
So many of us, Dan, as you were saying, remember the dot-com boom and bust. Assumedly, many more remember the 2008 recession. What constitutes a recession exactly? Is there a point where it becomes officially a recession?
Officially, it's after 6 months of economic contraction. It's a recession, but it's not called until it has to be viewed in hindsight. So it's really, you're going to hear the term recession, but it's not officially a recession until later. But business people right now are saying this feels like a recession. This has all the hallmarks of recession. So that's why you're seeing the term around so much right now.
And Moshe, what's the difference between a recession and a depression?
Depression is a one-of-a-kind term. There is no technical definition of a depression. We've kind of retired it after the 1930s and said, let's not repeat that again. And so if you remember, we were talking about, for example, during COVID, we were referring to it as the Great Recession because we just didn't want to use that term. I would add to Dan's point that the recessions in the U.S. are usually defined by an organization called the NBER. And they'll kind of say that, yes, this was officially a recession. It's almost like trying to verify that somebody, in fact, did indeed have a heart attack rather than speculate. But I can understand that, again, why a Princeton person would not want to mention Harvard, because that's usually where the NBR is located and how they define those recessions.
Any shots back, Dan?
No comment. I'm going to let Harvard go right now. There's enough in the news about that.
Well, let's take some questions from our listeners who've written in via email. And if you have a question, you can write in at Vermont Edition at vermontpublic.org. Barbara in Morrisville has an older car that's on its last legs and is wondering if they should try to hang on to it for another year or scramble to buy a new car now with the tariffs looming. Dan, what do you think? Any advice for Barbara?
Well, this is where it gets difficult because of
Yeah.
the uncertainty. So when things are changing hour to hour, no, it's not just businesses that can't plan. Consumers can't plan either. So that question is pretty custom to her situation. But at the moment, I would say if she can find a price that she's comfortable with, I might lean towards buying it and completing that transaction.
Yeah. And Moshe, any thoughts there on making a big purchase, especially in an industry that is going to be affected by some of these tariffs?
Yeah, the auto one is really the one that is the hard one to call, because we're hearing now that perhaps the auto tariffs might be reversed or reduced in the realization that the auto industry is a lot more integrated North America-wise than we thought, or at least than the president thought, not than we thought. We knew it was integrated. So it's possible then that some of the fears that we're hearing might dissipate a little bit. I think it's intensely a personal decision. And so if the listener feels that it's in their best interest, then hey, flip a coin. If you need a new car, then get a new car.
We also got an email from a listener named Brock, who I think was referring back to a conversation we were having towards the beginning of this hour about trade deficits. Brock writes, please explain trade deficits versus the balance of payments. Does the U.S. have a deficit in both? Does one or the other matter? Moshe, I think you were talking to us about trade deficits, so we'll give this one to you.
Yeah, so very interesting. So the balance of payments by definition must balance. So there is no such thing as a balance of payments deficit or surplus. And I'm very glad that listener brought it up, because I'm constantly having to explain that to people. What you have in the balance of payments are two accounts. One looks at trade in goods and services, like we discussed earlier. That's called the current account. The other side of the ledger is something called the capital account, or the financing account, which takes a look at buying of assets and movements of financial assets around. And so if you have a surplus on one of those accounts, you have a deficit on the other. And that's why the balance of payments has to balance. What happens in the US is that because they have this deficit on the trade side, it means that they have a surplus on the other side. And what that means is that there's a lot more money flowing into the US than is flowing out of the US. That helps to finance all of those American businesses that need money and can't get it from American saving. American consumers don't save enough. The American government certainly doesn't save enough. And so they rely on those inflows of dollars to try and help keep the engines of the U.S. economy running. So, in fact, it goes hand in hand. Any attempt to eliminate that trade deficit, like the president would want, would mean that a lot of that inflow of cash would also go away as well. And who's going to make up for that gap? It better be American consumers or the American government, or there's going to be a problem.
Dan, anything to
I just think
add there?
that's a good tie-in, that loop around and with the deficits, where someone has money in another place and it loops back to finance American businesses. That's what makes economics special. You can't, it's not, the money's moving in all kinds of directions. One thing I wanted to add too with a tariff, which is it's a very top-down system. So instead of that type of thing where money is moving around, it might be buying goods, it might be financing businesses. A tariff comes in and says, I'm going to insert myself in the transaction. I have a third party between two consenting participants. And it's something to really walk away from this whole discussion thinking about, is when you have a third party come in and say, no, I'm going to step in and say, I'm going to interfere. Here's a rule. I know better than the parties making the transaction. People don't tend to like that. A lot of bad things happen from that. And it's just it's a way to look at the world going forward, saying, where else does that exist that we could do away with that type of thing?
I have so many more questions for you, too, so we'll have to have you back on soon as these issues continue to develop. Dan Cunningham is the founder and CEO of One Day in July, an investment advisory firm in Burlington. Dan, thanks so much for your expertise today.
Thank you.
We're also joined by Moshe Lander, a senior lecturer of economics at Concordia University in Montreal. Moshe, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
What emotions is this conversation bringing up for you? I know whenever I talk about money and investing, I kind of start to feel behind, like I missed a lesson that other people got years earlier. In a minute, we're going to be joined by a money mindset coach who helps people work through their complicated emotions about money. If you have a question about how to manage those emotions or broach these topics with a loved one during this time of market uncertainty, call in at 800-639-2211. We'll be right back with more Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Talking about your personal finances can be stress-inducing, especially during a time of broader uncertainty and when concerns about a trade war or a global recession are being thrown around in the news. A money mindset coach in the Mad River Valley helps people talk more openly about their finances. Kathleen Byrne-Kingsbury is the founder of KBK Wealth Connection. She's the author of the book Breaking Money Silence: How to Shatter Money Taboos, Talk More Openly About Finances, and Live a Richer Life. She joins us now from Waitsfield. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you. I'm excited to join the conversation today.
Yeah. So tell us, in conversations that you've been having with clients and family and friends in the last couple of weeks since these trade tensions and tariffs have escalated, what are the main emotions that you're being confronted with right now?
I think that there's a lot of anxiety, nervousness, especially for people who are nearing retirement and maybe looking at those numbers in their investment portfolio falling in the wrong direction. There's also a lot of, I think, kind of questioning of not understanding why this is happening and really how this is going to impact them. So that overall feeling of being out of control.
Mm-hmm.
Which none of us like, right?
No, certainly not. And I mean, I get it, because when you see, on the news that picture of the red line of the stock market plummeting or the green arrow going up and up, it can feel like this directive to act in some way or another. But as we heard in our previous segment, it's often the best choice to take the long game when thinking about your personal investments. How do you counsel people to avoid being reactive?
Yes, I think that's the biggest point we want to make today is our knee-jerk kind of emotional reaction when we are facing a potential loss, that's looking at the numbers going down, is psychologically we are going to kind of fight or flight. And we actually process the psychological pain of a financial loss 2 times greater than we experience the joy from a financial gain. So it's very common for people to get in this fight or flight mode. And what's so important is to not let your emotions make the decisions for you, because research shows if we let our emotions decide our finances and make financial decisions, we tend to make really stupid decisions in the short run that ultimately hurt us in the long run, excuse me. So I completely agree. It's hard to do, but we need to stay the course and take a couple of deep breaths and really figure out, how do I manage that anxiety? What can I do to feel better in the short run, knowing that I don't want to make any big decisions now that might hurt me in the long run.
So let's talk about the person who, doesn't have a ton of money in the stock market or doesn't, look at it every single day, but they might have a 401k or an employer who's helping them save and prepare for retirement. What is your advice to that person on how to kind of weather this storm right now?
Well, I'd agree with some of the advice that was given earlier, and this is financial news, but I would say limit your exposure to the news that is specific around the economy. This is not to put your head in the sand, but it's to not overexpose yourself, because there is a way in which we can become obsessed with finding out the latest and trying to anticipate. And so maybe thinking about, how do I check in with the news maybe once a week, once a month, just kind of limiting that. I think the other thing is, if you're in a 401k or something like that, Often that is a longer term strategy. So again, not checking your balance every day, but really thinking about how do I check in maybe once a month, when those monthly statements come out. The other piece of advice, Michaela, I think is really important is at a time like this, when emotions run high, it's really important to get an objective perspective. So that might be talking to someone like Dan, who's an advisor, working with a money mindset coach to figure out how you can get another perspective, or even a trusted friend that maybe knows a little bit about finances. And the reason for that is because you need someone else in it with you who's not emotionally triggered. And that is often the purpose of an advisor or a coach or a trusted friend to really help you get perspective.
Okay, so that brings me to my next question. In a couple, it's common for one person in the relationship to be the one who kind of handles the money issues, and the other person takes a back seat. Do you find that division of labor works okay, in your opinion, or can it lead to issues?
It can lead to issues. It's very common, however. What I encourage people to do in couplehood is that you don't have to love, finance. You don't have to be the one that's passionate about it. But each partner should be involved on some level of like a high level of knowing what's going on, where the money's coming in, where is it going out. And unfortunately, a lot of times, and this is stereotypical, it's changing, but it hasn't changed enough. It's often the woman who in the back seat, or the wife, mother, and defaulting to her partner, her male partner. And I really encourage couples, and maybe this is the opportunity in what's going on right now, to figure out how to engage in some financial conversations just at a high level to make sure everybody is aware of what's going on. So ultimately, the division of labor, maybe around trash or groceries, makes a lot of sense, but around finances isn't in the best interest of the family.
Well, Kathleen, I really appreciated your point that you were making earlier, as were our other guests, about not acting reactively to this moment, and perhaps taking a look back through history to see what we can learn. We got a question from Robert in Belvedere, who wanted to know how this current financial crisis that we're in, whether or not you'd call it that, I'm not sure, but how it's different. This moment is different from previous financial crises. It could be the 2008 recession, the dot-com bust, what happened during COVID. And he wants to know how the differences, what they might mean for individual investors.
Well, it's an interesting question. I think that no matter what time in history we're looking at, there's a different trigger that triggers the uncertainty and the volatility. And so certainly this trigger is different because it's based on the policies of the current administration. So that is different than what happened during COVID or what happened during the dot-com boom. However, I think no matter what the trigger is, the thing that we need to do as people who are affected by these decisions is manage those emotions, to try to really focus on the things that you can control. Earlier, I think it was Dan said that we can't control the stock market, but we can control, how are we spending our days? Are we getting out in nature? Are we exercising? Are we thinking about, even though there's a time of uncertainty, what are we grateful for? I know one practice that I've engaged in the past couple of months has been keeping a gratitude journal. Now, people may be rolling their eyes. Trust me, I know. Sometimes they're like, coach and a gratitude journal. I get it. But what it has forced me to do, and it's been really fascinating because I haven't done it before, is each morning I have to think about what's one tiny small thing that I'm thankful for. And it really does shift your brain and shift your focus. Does it solve all the anxiety around what's going on in the world? No. But it gives you a sense of, okay, there are some really good things going on as well. So I really encourage people to practice being mindful, practice getting out in nature, whatever it is that helps you distract, that there's a healthy level of distraction that I think we all need to take when we're in these situations.
Hear, hear. Well, Kathleen, one of the other themes that I heard emerging in our conversation today was the additional stress that is caused by these cross-border tensions. And normally, Vermont and Quebec have enjoyed a really close relationship, and people often cross that border for recreation or business. And now that's being challenged, getting harder in some situations. I'm curious if that has come up for you with any of your local clients.
Actually, I do a lot of work both throughout the United States as well as in Canada. So yes, that conversation has come up. I also have friends who are Canadian, and I think there's a level of fear and just uncertainty that we haven't faced before, in recent generations. Again, I think it's really about staying connected, having conversations, being able to put it in perspective, because our fear that something's going to happen doesn't mean it's going to happen. And so really trying to stick with the facts. I also think it's important, and I can't say this, I'm a former therapist turned coach, that we also need to embrace what we're feeling. We don't want to just ignore it. Michaela, we want to spend some time actually validating it. And so maybe it's,
Oh no,
a
I'm a
couple
big fan of repression, Kathleen. You're not going to get me.
Don't, well, I came from an Irish family, so I'm really good at ignoring things, but I really think that it's healthier for us to pay attention. And so
Fine.
paying attention could be 2-3 minute conversation, with your friends or your partner. And then maybe the next 15-20 minutes after that, you watch a funny show. So it's finding that balance that's going to work for you. But yes, it's definitely a different feeling than I think my clients or my colleagues, or certainly I have as a business owner, had in the past.
Kathleen, I'm wondering if you might be able to suggest some resources for us. It could be news sources, could be books or a podcast for people who have newly been immersed in the financial turmoil of the day, and want a good source of information, either for news or for financial news or for basic investing tenets.
I think there's a great book out there, and I'm not going to say my own book, although I think my book is good, called Money Psychology. And it's literally, the title is that simple. And I find that when people read that book, they get a sense of, oh, that's why humans react the way they do around finance. And in the book, the author really does talk about markets and a broader level of how emotions really impact everything. So I think if you are a reader, that's a great read. If you prefer a podcast, I was recently on a colleague's podcast called the Human Centric Podcast. And so that's all about behavioral finance. And I think it's a great time to start to learn about how our thoughts and feelings impact our financial decisions. That's also known as a mindset, like our money mindset. I think those, that's a good podcast to listen to. And I just think, really staying in tune, and maybe if you were, resistant to reach out to an advisor in the past or work with a money coach, now might be a time to reach out and get that type of support. So hopefully those two resources can be helpful to people.
Thank you. I just did a quick Google. I believe you're referring to the book, The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel.
Yes, sorry.
Kathleen Burns Kingsbury is the founder of KBK Wealth Connection. She's also the author of the book Breaking Money Silence: How to Shatter Money Taboos, Talk More Openly About Finances, and Live a Richer Life. And she's based in Waitsfield. Kathleen, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you for breaking money silence with me.
Well, tomorrow on Vermont Edition, we're going to take a turn towards the arts to discuss the 5th annual Made Here Film Festival, which kicks off next week. We'll also speak with a Bennington College professor who has a new novel out. It's about a young Muslim scholar who gives up her career in academia and, get this, decides to marry rich. Join us for those conversations on Vermont Edition tomorrow at noon. Today's show was directed by Aaliyah Papes. Our managing producer is John Ahrens, and our producers are Andrea Lorian and Daniela Fierro. Anna Berg is our intern, and our call screener is Rick Barrett. Our theme music was composed by Myra Flynn. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch up again soon.